Eduardo Galeano starts his book, Open Veins of Latin America, with the journey of Christopher Columbus as he sails across the ocean and with the origins of Spanish Empire. But he ends it on this note, this fairly iconic observation, because it's pretty undeniable. He says, slave ships no longer ply the ocean. Today, the slavers operate from the ministries of labor. Welcome back to Champagne Anarchism. Hello, and welcome back to the final chapter of Open Veins of Latin America, this absolutely fantastic book. If you have made it this far, you should feel really, really proud. I mean, this is a monumental work. This is a huge accomplishment to have read through this entire thing and come out here. This is the last chapter, not of the original book, but this is the chapter that he wrote 7 years later. This is him coming back kind of in the context of Operation Condor and all of this stuff that we talked about before, a rising tide of violence and anti-leftist sentiment across Latin America, and Galeano in exile is looking back at this work, this kind of titanic Open Veins of Latin America, and he's writing another chapter afterwards. And I thought, even though this probably won't be the longest video in the world, because a lot of this we have already gone through, and it's a fairly short chapter already, so we won't retread over ground that we've already tread over, all of that stuff. Even though all of that is true, I still thought, let's make a separate video just on this chapter, just to wrap up some kind of final thoughts here. And it's a perfect opportunity to do that. So yes, if you've made it, if you've read through this entire book along with this series, congratulations. I mean, that is huge. This looms so large over a lot of other books that have been written about Latin America. I mean, this is really a legacy. This is a legendary, let's say, book about Latin American history and Latin American thought. And so by entering and reading this book, you have entered a world of thought that is, I think, pretty unique. There is a body of work out there that can be described as kind of pan-American, and Galeano really, really exists in this world. Just like you have sort of pan-Africanist thought and pan-Asian thought, there is a pan-Americanist thought that is very powerful, and there's a long intellectual tradition behind it, and Galeano, kind of one of those foremost writers of this tradition. And I hope that you found it kind of rewarding and interesting to read, at least. And as always, let me know your comments, let me know what you think about this chapter, this book, whatever it is, here, social media, Patreon, everything. And before we dig into the actual book, and I'll give you the roadmap in a sec, but before we dig in, let me say, please like and subscribe here, YouTube, social media, and definitely check out the Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/champagne anarchism. There is a full reading series up there. I try to tackle these kind of great works of leftist literature. We've done Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. We've done Arundhati Roy's Capitalism, a Ghost Story. We've done Herman and Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. And of course, we have done Emma Goldman's Anarchism and Other Essays. And we are finishing Open Veins of Latin America. And next week, we will be talking, or actually the week after next, I'll explain after this, the plan going forward. But the next book that we're doing is Murray Bookchin's The Ecology of Freedom. This is a pretty thick tome. This is a bit of an undertaking. So we'll get there, but and I'll explain a little bit about this book at the end of this video, so we'll get into it then. But let's dig right in, and we'll start with a bit of a roadmap. Now, as always, this chapter, Galeano, is quite scattered. I mean, in typical Galeano fashion, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of different details and stuff that he's hurling out, some really brilliant writing. So we're going to group these into kind of four main thoughts. And we're skipping out on some of the debt stuff because we talked about that before, but we will get into some of the major arguments in here. So first, we're going to talk just a little bit about what was happening in Latin America at the time. We're going to give a little bit of a historical update here because Galeano, this is 7 years later, and he's really in the thick of it. So we'll talk a little bit about what was going on then. Second, we'll look at an argument that he's been building this entire book, but really focuses in on this chapter, and that is that extraction government requires violence. It rests on this bedrock of violence. Third, we'll drill down into a really interesting idea that I continuously come back to, and that's this idea that democracy is only allowed insofar as it doesn't step on the toes of the powerful. So if you're actually challenging the powerful, guess what? Democracy doesn't really matter. Those rights that you think you have, they don't matter. But if it doesn't, then yes, you will have democracy. You will have an open and free society. It's just as much as is allowed. And boy, do I have some thoughts on that one. Finally, we'll talk about the very last part of the chapter and maybe this glimmer of hope that Galeano wants to leave us with. This is pretty typical of Galeano. He's both a deep cynic and an extraordinary optimist. It's a really weird mix with Galeano, and it's one of the things that I love the most about a book like Open Veins. So we'll talk a little bit about what hope is there still. You know, this ultimately is just Galeano at the end coming back and saying, yes, all of this is true. Everything we've said throughout this entire book, all these couple hundred pages, all of this is true, yet people still fight. And it's kind of a beautiful idea. So we'll get into that in a bit. And this is the structure. And so without further ado, let's dig in. Right, so let's start with the idea that Galeano sets out here that history remains a cruel mistress. This is kind of the language that he uses. It may be a little anti-feminist, but fine. It will give him some poetic license, Galeano, in this book. This is set in those 7 years, again, after 1971. He publishes the original version of this book in 1971 and then comes back 7 years later to talk about what's happened. And remember, he has given us a sweeping vision of history, starting from the early days of colonization through the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, and then eventually the United States comes in and starts to extract from the open veins of Latin America, all of this. So he's got this historical context, but still, the 1970s in Latin America is a period of extraordinary upheaval. I mean, this is one of the darkest periods in modern Latin American history, and it's for a very good reason. We'll talk about Operation Condor in just a little bit, or Plan Condor. So there are two particularly cataclysmic events for Galeano, and they both happen in 1973. 2 years after this book initially comes out. The first is the fall of Salvador Allende in Chile. Now, this is, for a lot of people, it really marks kind of a turning point in a lot of things, because Allende, there was a lot of hope and faith invested in Allende, and Allende is a complicated figure. And I have plenty of thoughts on Allende, but this is not a Chilean history video, so I won't get too deep into that. But Allende's government is very, very hopeful and extremely ambitious, and those ambitions were really failing by the time Allende's government falls. And what replaces him is just this period of absolute fascistic brutality that takes hold over Chile. This is, of course, the rise of Augusto Pinochet, and the general that assumes the presidency, and he stays in power until 1998, when he's eventually ejected by a plebiscite. So this is kind of an event that looms over Latin American history, and it's one of those things that you kind of have to know a lot about to really understand the mindset that Galeano was in at the time that he was writing. Of course, the second event that takes place is back in his home country of Uruguay, and this is why he's in exile in the first place. But back in Uruguay also falls to military dictatorship. That also happens in 1973. Now, he talks a lot about Pinochet and Chile and the terror of living in Chile at the time. He doesn't really get into Uruguay's case, and I can't tell you why. I would just be speculating. Of course, he does write a lot about this later on, but this is something that he just kind of obliquely addresses in Open Veins. Is it too sensitive? Is it too much to bear? Is it he just has tons of stuff to talk about? Otherwise, I don't know. I would just be speculating. But either way, He spends a lot of time in Chile and not a lot of time in Uruguay in this last chapter, and it's interesting to kind of compare. So those are the two main cataclysmic events that really change Galeano's conditions. But there is a broader context to this, and in Latin America, that broader context at the time, which he points out very correctly, is the creeping pace of militarization across the region, just in a number of countries. Now, of course, at the time, he doesn't have the name Operation Condor, which is exactly what's happening, but he is seeing the effects. He mentions, for example, uprisings in Bolivia and in Nicaragua. Now, Bolivia, this is taking place under Hugo Banzer, who we talked about a little bit in previous videos. He's this dictator that looms large over Bolivian history, and he actually comes back later to the presidency later on in life. This is actually kind of a theme in Latin American history. Either way, that's Hugo Banzer in Bolivia and his brutal repression of some uprisings that happened at the time. But you also have Nicaragua, and Nicaragua's case is kind of interesting because at the time at which Galeano is writing this, he doesn't know that this is going to turn into the Nicaraguan Revolution of 1979 that comes in 1979, but he can see its early stirrings. This is going to become the Sandinista Revolution of 1979, and it is a hugely significant event in Nicaraguan history and kind of a watershed event in Central American history as well. If you want a little more information on the Sandinistas and this revolution in 1979 and a lot of the American response that accompanied it, and I would argue eventually crushed the Sandinista rebellion, although not directly, not militarily, but through other means, check out the series that I did on manufacturing consent. I think that provides a lot of background on this, and some of the work that Herman and Chomsky do in that book to critically look at the media analysis around the Sandinistas and their later election cycles is, I think, absolutely fascinating. But this is where I'll leave this for Galeano's purposes. He doesn't know this is going to turn into the Sandinista revolution at the time, but he's writing this in a context where he can kind of point to it and say, hey, there's a lot of stuff happening in Nicaragua right now. But of course, he talks about other places. He talks about, for example, Brazil, which ends up joining Operation Condor, though doesn't officially sign the founding document. But Brazil is very much a member of this. And Brazil, he points out, is spending significantly more on its militarization efforts and its military presence, which he admits is impressive, and spending way more on that militarization than it is on things like education, for example. And kind of most of all, bubbling away in the background, Galeano talks about how the United States at every point is kind of behind the scenes, right? They are picking the Latin American rulers, and the Latin American rulers kind of need to be approved by the United States to remain in power. And of course, he actually didn't know at the time that he was writing just how true that was. A lot of stuff came out after the fact, after multiple investigations and major investigations into things like Operation Condor, to reveal the extent to which the United States was involved and did know about this militarization and this absolute brutal campaign across the region. So there's a lot of truth to what he says when he's writing this book, and later on we find out just how true it was. And if you want a little more information on Operation Condor and what it was, and the Letelier assassination, for example, which happens in DC and ends up being one of those events that kind of pulls the US a little bit out of it in the end, I have a lot more information in the introduction lecture to this book. So you can go back if you haven't seen it already and look, just see a little bit of context for Operation Condor and the reasons why Galeano was forced into exile from Uruguay. He goes first to Argentina and then eventually from Spain. And this chapter, in fact, is written from Barcelona. So all of that's just to say there is more information out there, and just because we've kind of already done it, I'm not going to rehash all of the Operation Condor stuff here. But this is a perfect entry point to the second thing that I want to talk about, which of course is that violence underpins extraction. Violence is always necessary to keep this system of extraction running. And Galeano actually makes this point in a really interesting way, because he starts this point of the chapter by talking about Haiti and the miserable conditions that Haitians are in, living under François Duvalier. That's Papa Doc Duvalier, as he was more popularly known, this incredibly brutal dictator. And he compares Duvalier to Jorge Rafael Videla, who was then ruling Argentina at the time. And basically, his point here is they're exactly the same, but that matters for a very specific reason, because when he was in Buenos Aires, working as a writer, living in exile from Uruguay, when he's in Buenos Aires, there was a major conservative newspaper that came out and was very kind of exercised, really angry and annoyed about this international body that had described Argentina as a developing country. And this paper was saying, well, how dare they? You know, how could Argentina be a developing country? How could it be compared to something like Haiti? Look at the conditions that Haiti is living under. And what Galeano is saying here is the conditions are exactly the same. The oppression happens with different technology in Argentina. In Argentina, they just had a higher level of technology, but the function of what General Videla was doing was exactly what Papa Doc Duvalier was doing in Haiti. There is just the oppression, and the oppression serves one purpose, and that is to deliver cheap labor and cheap products to the global north, to the metropole, to the developed world, whatever terminology you would like to use. And the phrase he uses is to supply cheap labor to an international market that demands cheap products. It's pretty succinctly put, and it's tough to say anything more than that, really. But now we get into a little bit of a thorny issue here, because Galeano, because of his understanding of the world and the way that he has constructed the system and old school dependency theory and all the stuff that we've talked about before, he has this idea of the world as developing countries and the populations in the developing countries becoming poorer and poorer over time. They sort of are more and more extracted from because of this thing called declining terms of trade, which we've talked a little bit about before. That's not necessarily true. Now, there is the other side of that argument, which people who defend capitalism love to make. This argument that capitalism has lifted billions of people out of poverty. That is nonsense, and it's nonsense for several reasons, but the main reason it's nonsense is because we don't account for inequality when we talk about things like that. So it is true that there has been some development in those developing countries, especially in Latin America, and especially in other more developmentalist countries. We talked about protectionism in, I think, the chapter right before this. And there has been an effect on poverty, and there have been people who have been lifted above the internationally set poverty line, this kind of nonsensical metric that we lean on a lot of the time. It doesn't describe very much, but can be a little bit helpful when we look at stuff like this. So it has actually been the case that some isolated pockets of isolated countries have been lifted out of poverty, and things have broadly gotten better in certain situations and certain circumstances. And that does seem to go against Galeano's point. But this is such a difference in scale that it almost is meaningless. So global inequality over this period has exploded. So at the same time that that little bit of capital is trickling down to the poorest, there is a massive explosion in the wealth of developed nations, and especially in the elites of those developed nations. And then beyond that, the main thing that Galeano is worried about here is that violence that underpins exploitation. You know, Galeano is saying throughout this entire book, look what elites have done. Look at what these empires have done. This violence creates the conditions of poverty in the first place that forces people into these international markets so that they have to be selling their cheap labor and providing cheap products to the developed world. This is a system that he's criticizing. This is a structure that he's criticizing. So even if Galeano's analysis about declining terms of trade is not always true, his broader point absolutely is. You know, this system that he's critiquing requires poverty. You know, built into this international system is exploitation. And to keep the exploitation going, you need violence. And that's a perfect way into the kind of third thing that I want to talk about here, which is that democracy is allowed only when it doesn't step on the toes of the powerful. So this is one of the most interesting things in this chapter. It's something that I think about kind of a lot, just in terms of especially the developed world, because I don't think we're necessarily aware of how true this idea is. And it's summed up perfectly in just one line from Galeano. He says, "Torture wouldn't exist in our countries if it weren't effective. Formal democracy would continue if it could be guaranteed not to get out of the hands that hold power." And I think about this especially recently in the context of a place like Puerto Rico or a place like Flint, Michigan. Pockets of the world, we could say the developed world. Puerto Rico is part of the United States, and Flint, Michigan is literally a city in the United States that had their democracy suspended so that investors could be paid back. And that's not hyperbole. Promesa established a non-elected board to control Puerto Rican affairs. Flint, Michigan had an emergency manager come in to run the city and just a suspension of democracy to do that. This happens kind of a lot. And we often have this idea, especially in the developed world where this isn't so immediate and present, because in the developing world, we have seen this happen, but in the developed world, you may not necessarily know that this is going on. But we have this idea that we have rights and protections that are afforded to us no matter what. They kind of stay with us and we can always access them. But Galeano is here to say, actually, no. Galeano is saying, and he's absolutely right, that we only have the rights that don't threaten the people in power. If government of the elite is this giant Leviathan, then as soon as you poke Leviathan, you're going to actually find out. And there's a scale effect here, right? Galeano says in this book that the more acute the threat, the more brutal the response from the government is. And I'm saying government when I should say state, but either way, the point is that once you start poking Leviathan, you find out quite quickly that actually you have no rights. There is actually no true democracy. It's all a smokescreen. It's all in service of power. And that brings us to the fourth point, which is there a glimmer of hope there? Now, this final bit I really love. Genuinely, I love it because in very Galeano fashion, it's conflicted, it's a little cryptic, it's a little weird, but it does leave us with a sense of kind of hope, of just a little bit of optimism, which Galeano, I think, is a genuinely wonderfully optimistic writer, even though I know he writes these things. I know everything he says in this book and Memory of Fire, everything that comes after this is deeply, deeply cynical and angry, right? There's a fury and there's a rage that comes through Open Veins of Latin America that I think is so powerful and is why this book continues to endure. But underpinning that, the reason it is so effective, that rage, is because it all comes from a place of optimism, and that is so powerful. Because what Galeano is telling us is that, yes, all of this is true, but unaccountably, people still continue to fight. Now, part of the fight is those uprisings that Galeano is mentioning, the things that got crushed in the dictatorships that he's talking about, especially labor rights movements. He talks about workers striking during the Pinochet reign of terror. All of this is absolutely true. There is another component of this, however, which is also quite interesting, which is kind of the work that Galeano himself is doing. Galeano is out here and he's telling these stories, and we are reading them, and we are taking part in this thing that he wants to communicate, right? He wants to talk directly to you. And he says this at the start of this chapter, right? When he sort of sideswipes at these really intense kind of leftists who write in these arcane ways that you can't really understand. Galeano is not interested in any of that. Galeano is interested in speaking from his heart to your heart, and he talks about the power of memory. All memory is subversive, Galeano says. And so Galeano is very much himself taking part in this struggle by literally writing the words on the page. And we can see how influential Galeano actually was. When we think about a writer like Isabel Allende, like clutching a copy of Open Veins of Latin America as she flees Chile. This book has inspired people, it has changed minds, and that is really, really powerful. And also, maybe this is a little selfish, but I like to think that just us reading this book going through this, understanding these words and these stories and keeping these memories alive is also a little bit a part of that struggle, right? It's the other side of that taking part in keeping the memory alive. And so there is something deeply powerful in that. And so there's this tiny scrap of hope right in the final paragraph of this book, and it comes in typical Galeano fashion, which is a little bit cryptic and a lot gorgeous. This is what he says. He says, "In the history of humankind, every act of destruction meets its response, sooner or later, in an act of creation." And with that last sentence of Open Veins of Latin America, we will close out this book. Finally, if you have gone through this book with this reading series, thank you so much. It's been such a privilege to be able to come here and talk about this book. I absolutely love Galeano and all of his work, and Open Veins of Latin America is just such a classic. It's just really, really cool to get back into this and be reading through it, and to get so many comments back as well from people on social media. And people really, really care about this book, and I think that's amazing. So thank you for joining for this kind of expedition into Open Veins. I hope you found it helpful and interesting and maybe a little bit eye-opening. And if you did, please let me know. Now, there will actually be one more video that I'm going to do on Open Veins of Latin America that will be a kind of summation of all of these videos together. Just a little bit of, okay, if you don't necessarily have the time to jump right into this book and start reading, and I really appreciate that a lot of people don't have that time to read a book like this. I hope eventually you do, but if you don't yet have the time to jump into this, I'm going to do a video that's just kind of what you need to know. You know, what are the main themes? What are the main arguments? What are the main things that come through from Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America, just to make sure that this book can kind of get into as many hands as possible, and people can kind of understand the arguments that Galeano was making back then, and hopefully a little bit about how they apply to today. So I want to make something that's a little bit more user-friendly, and that will delay the next book by 1 week. I'll put all that information up on the Patreon when that goes out. And of course, little mini preview for the next book, Murray Bookchin's The Ecology of Freedom. If you want a anarchist, of course, Bookchin later in life did not describe himself as an anarchist, but I think it's fair to say a lot of this is very, very anarchist. Bookchin's The Ecology of Freedom is a new understanding of how we as humanity can take part in the natural world. It is a fantastic book. The thing is, it's pretty tough to get through. It's a bit of a slog. It's one of those reasons it's a book that I think has sat on a lot of people's bookshelves for quite a while. This is quite a tome, really. So I want to go through this piece by piece. I'm not going to take too long with it. It's going to be done over the course of 6 weeks. So each week there will be 2 chapters that will break down and analyze in a readable and interesting format. Bookchin can be very wordy. He is quite a verbose writer. It's very, very interesting stuff, but yeah, it can be a little bit gnarly and technical and all that stuff. So that's why I think it could be helpful to read this in series form, along with a couple videos that will explain the kind of main ideas that he's trying to get to. And Bookchin, I mean, it is also just a real pleasure to read Bookchin. It's a hard turn from Galeano, I will say that. But it's still fantastic and so important if you take ecology and the environment, although that is a word that he criticizes in this book, but the ecology of the world very seriously. So that will drop 2 weeks from now, and I hope to see you for that. As always, let me know what you think. Check out that Patreon channel. Again, that's patreon.com/champagneanarchism, and I will see you next time. Thank you.